The Lost Soul.
Chapter 1. The Soul. What does psychology, the science of the soul, truly know about the soul itself? In truth, almost nothing. The soul is a concept that's difficult to prove or disprove, much like trying to verify the existence of a ghost in the attic. But what if, instead of subjecting it to scientific scrutiny, we simply imagined a special instrument capable of revealing this delicate spiritual essence? Armed with such a magical tool, perhaps a third eye, we might perceive an ethereal, shimmering entity without form, gender, face, or name. For simplicity's sake, we might call this entity the soul. The soul doesn't remember where it came from or what it is. It is weightless, bodiless, and unselfish, yet far from emotionless. The soul can feel boredom, indifference, joy, sorrow, and love. It has no need to think about the future or make plans. Its role is simply to exist, to be aware, to feel. When the soul feels bored, it seems to freeze and almost disappear, becoming a mere shadow of itself. But when it is joyful or filled with love, it glows. And in those moments, it truly lives. Yet this state is fleeting. At times, it grieves, becoming like a small, heavy cloud. The soul finds pain and suffering, especially when it cannot alleviate them, unbearable. Yes, the soul is a spiritual being, but it is neither perfect nor flawless. If you were to imagine yourself as a researcher of human souls, you would undoubtedly be intrigued by this story. She was one of those spiritual beings that lived in a large city among people, though she had never encountered anyone like herself. Weightless, she floated in the air, peeking through windows. The soul often yearned to draw closer to people, to touch them, to be noticed. Yet no one ever sensed her presence. One day, she observed a funny little boy named Michael, who seemed to intuitively react to her presence. Every time she came near, he would start to sneeze. The soul felt lonely. Invisibility was a difficult trial. So, she began visiting Michael more often. His slowness, carefree nature, and genuine joy delighted her. The soul laughed and grieved alongside him. Michael became her primary focus, but she wasn't his mother, sister, or friend. Just an invisible empath, becoming part of his life. Years passed, and the boy grew into a sarcastic teenager. At first, the soul found this amusing, but soon, his changes began to worry her. As Michael matured, he unconsciously adopted the values and habits of his surroundings, which the soul found alien and sometimes even crude. He delved into the world of video games, where virtual reality replaced real life. He began wearing military-style clothing, and to the soul, it seemed he was hiding his essence behind this camouflage. The soul suffered, unable to share his interests any longer. Now, she tried to visit him only early in the morning, those rare moments when he still radiated the light she loved, smiling and enjoying life without any particular purpose. But as Michael, influenced by questionable company, grew harsher and more callous, the soul felt a cold dread. Her love for him was unconditional and selfless, yet even such love couldn't escape pain and regret. Each time she visited, she felt her inner light dimming. Gradually, love gave way to sadness and helplessness. Then, one day, she experienced a new emotion: relief when Michael was not around. The soul left the gray city, returning to her radiant, luminous state. She wandered among people, seeking to once again feel the genuine joy she had once found with Michael. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of brilliance in those immersed in creative endeavors. But as soon as these individuals became obsessed with success, their light faded, and the fragrance of inspiration soured into something toxic. Thus, the soul set out on a journey to so-called indigenous peoples. Indigenous only at first glance, for in reality, their spiritual development often surpassed that of urban dwellers. The soul responded to the call of an old shaman and listened to his songs mimicking the sounds of wind, bird calls, and animal howls. The shaman donned garments adorned with bones to enter the spirit world and seek its blessing. The soul felt deep respect for these rituals, though she didn't fully understand their meaning. How could a spirit be connected to death if, by its nature, it was immortal? After all, the soul believed it died only in moments of despair and fading, and came alive only when it found happiness and light. One night, the old shaman lit a cigarette, opened a can of cola, and took a sip of the sweet drink. Gradually, he entered an altered state of consciousness, where everything became clear to him. At that moment, he finally saw her, a bodiless, shimmering spiritual entity in the dim light. Stepping beyond his own body, the shaman reached out to the soul, and together they floated through radiant waves. They hovered side by side, sharing moments of unity and silence, until the shaman began to dissolve, becoming part of everything, merging with the boundless harmony of the world. He disappeared, and she wandered through this strange space, unable to understand why his spirit had separated from his body. What was death, truly? The soul found no answer. Who was she herself? Did she belong to someone else? Or had she always been a formless and impersonal being? The soul continued her journey, adopting new forms. For a time, she resided in the jungle, becoming invisible dew on leaves, evaporating under the warm morning sun, only to gather into clouds and fall again as rain. One day, as a rain cloud, she found herself above the ocean. There, sinking into its waters, the soul felt like a wave, ever moving, playfully caught by the wind and dolphins. At that moment, she dissolved, like a grain of salt, becoming part of the vast ocean. It seemed as though she had reached her limit. The soul was no longer a separate entity, having found unity with the boundless sea. But what might have seemed the end of her little story was merely the beginning of a new chapter. After all, not every soul becomes part of something so magnificent. The ocean, a wondrous living source of energy and love, giving life to millions of creatures, already had a soul of its own. Realizing this, the soul felt an acute incompleteness and loneliness. She was drawn to a pod of dolphins frolicking in the waves. She fell in love with their lightness, freedom, and joy, dreaming of becoming their soul, happy, carefree, part of their world. But the dolphins remained indifferent, living their lives without noticing her shimmering presence. Wandering the world, the soul sought someone to belong to, someone who would respond to her longing. But all her attempts to find her place, her purpose, ended in nothing. Chapter 2. Michael. Michael was a gloomy cynic who valued his independence above all else. Yet behind this mask lay a profound emptiness that had consumed his life entirely. His days were gray and monotonous. Neither work, nor the occasional meeting with friends, nor fleeting amusements brought him any real satisfaction. Gradually, Michael found solace in horror stories and films. Immersing himself in them, he felt a strange relief. Vivid images of fear, pain, and terror mixed with passion, filling the void that gnawed at him from within. He lived through these stories, imagining himself alternately as a victim, a cold-blooded aggressor, or even fear itself personified. Every evening before bed, Michael replayed horror scenes in his mind, meticulously crafting details and immersing himself in the pain, suffering, and terror. This became his drug, a source of intense emotions he quickly began to crave more and more. The scenes of horror soon flooded his consciousness, and one day he began to write. Everything poured out onto paper, and his visions came to life, gaining tangible form. A nearly forgotten sense of joy enveloped him, reminiscent of his childhood, when he would draw fantastical creatures with a single pencil. Now he plunged into his dark stories, living them from the inside out. Michael's books gained popularity. People were drawn to his dark, sinister plots, steeped in tension and fear. Before long, he was invited to Hollywood. As he sat on the plane, he felt the emptiness within him filling with something significant, as if his life was finally gaining meaning. His new life captivated him. Working in Hollywood was grueling, the competition fierce, and the demands relentless. Yet Michael relished the feeling of living on the edge. The pressure from demanding managers and the looming risk of failure fueled his imagination, inspiring him to create ever more terrifying visions. His work, paired with good whiskey, gave birth to monsters, symbols of everything he both despised and adored. Like an addict, he sought increasingly horrific plots. When one idea grew dull, he conjured something even more grotesque and brutal, which always resonated with his audience. But with each project, Michael found it harder to show up to work sober. His colleagues and environment even encouraged his drinking. It seemed to enhance his productivity and adaptability. He churned out nightmare after nightmare, feeling little attachment to his creations and sometimes even revulsion. Yet he pressed on, afraid to stop. His success was as bleak as his work. Michael lost track of days, forgetting who he had met and when. Every random woman in his life became a fleeting muse for a new, terrifying plot. Love seemed fake and meaningless to him, and each romance was just another empty page in the book of his existence. With every nightmare he created, he felt stronger and more detached, building a protective armor against the outside world. But the deep emptiness inside continued to devour him. One day, Michael decided to make that emptiness the central character in one of his stories. It became a dark entity that crept out of the shadows and consumed everything: personalities, souls, bodies, leaving behind nothing but a hollow sense of anxiety and loneliness. This character felt like the embodiment of what Michael himself was experiencing. However, Michael's professional journey came to an abrupt and unexpected end. One morning, he woke up to find himself in bed with his boss, a woman with whom he had created countless monsters in his scripts. But now, something physical and uncomfortably real had formed between them. At that moment, Michael looked at himself from the outside and said, "Stop." Chapter 3: The Himalayas. Michael decided to journey to the Himalayas, seeking renewal and cleansing, hoping to find both among the snow-covered peaks. The hardships of the trek brought him unexpected satisfaction. The physical discomfort of mountain trails and the harsh beauty of nature made him strangely happy. There was no room here for the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. Everything felt raw, real, and unfiltered. He settled in a small tourist town at the foot of the mountains, enjoying the simple pleasures of life while preparing for more challenging hikes. Initially, the mountains enchanted him with their unfamiliarity, but over time, boredom and loneliness set in. Yet it was here, amidst the rocks, meadows, and misty forests, that Michael first discovered a peace he had never known in the city. At some point, he made a bold decision. He would climb Mount Everest. The very thought of brushing close to death, of encountering the bodies of climbers who had perished along the way, thrilled and drew him in. Contemplating mortality, its imminent possibility, always helped him feel life more keenly. Reaching one of the higher points, he stood with other climbers and watched airplanes flying below them. A wave of ecstasy washed over him, and for a fleeting moment, he felt the sharpness of existence in its purest form. Despite the exhaustion and the crushing weight of his gear, he pressed on, hoping that the journey would justify the effort. But then, amidst the dense clouds, he saw a snow avalanche barreling toward him. Without hesitation, Michael leaped into a hollow in the rock and curled into a fetal position, as the rescue guides had taught him. The snow roared down, encasing his body like concrete. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with air that now seemed precious. Time slowed, and each breath became labored and heavy. Michael drifted into unconsciousness, and in his dream, he soared over an ocean of shimmering silver, leaping effortlessly between the shores of Antarctica and Australia. At that moment, his soul became aware of his fragile state, sensing he was teetering on the brink of life and death. In an instant, it was beside him, an invisible observer, intangible and silent. The soul realized it was inextricably tied to him, a mere half of a whole. It longed to reunite with Michael, even if only for a fleeting moment before his death. But it couldn't. They now existed in separate dimensions. The soul screamed in helplessness, but its voice was swallowed by silence. Michael could not feel its presence, and it could not become part of him again. Michael's avalanche beacon, a device designed to locate buried climbers, saved him. But he soon learned that others in his group, including the Sherpa carrying his gear, had perished. The news shook him deeply, forcing him to confront the fragility of life and the vast chasm between his fantasies of death and its harsh reality. For the first time, he understood that death was not some imaginary monster, but a grim truth that took people without asking for their consent. After his rescue, Michael developed an acute appreciation for simple things. The mountain air, a cup of hot tea, and small pleasures filled him with a sense of tranquility. He wandered through the tourist town, observing people and reflecting on his experience. The stark awareness of his mortality revealed the value of every fleeting moment. Meanwhile, his soul was tormented by questions. When and why had it started seeing Michael as a stranger? When had it first abandoned him? Its memories of that time were hazy, but the truth flashed before it like lightning. At some point, after the soul had first detached from Michael's body, it lost the sense of belonging, even though the connection remained. The soul had lingered close as he grew. But when Michael began to mature, its fears and rejection of his changes drove them apart. The soul turned away from him, precisely when he needed it most, consumed by the external world, and his search for a place in it. Now, the soul understood. It had left Michael alone in this cold, cruel world. Its punishment was eternal solitude and the impossibility of reuniting with him. Chapter 4. Tirtha. In Kathmandu, Michael encountered a wandering ascetic, a half-naked man smeared with ash, who considered himself dead. The man was emaciated, and Michael offered him some money before buying him food. As the man ate, Michael tried to strike up a conversation. Surprisingly, the man spoke decent English and shared his story. His name was Tirtha, and he was an ascetic devoted to Hindu practices. But he had not always been this way. Once, he was an ordinary man working as a guide on a small tourist boat at a mountain lake. One day, a sudden storm swept through. The weather in the mountains is unpredictable, and the boat capsized. Tirtha took charge of rescuing the passengers. They were all wearing life jackets, so no one should have drowned. However, one child, the son of a crew member, couldn't be saved. The boy's backpack had gotten caught in the boat's seat, trapping him despite his life jacket. The rescuers couldn't reach him in time. Tirtha was consumed by guilt and attended the boy's funeral, which was held in the Hindu tradition on a riverbank. The child's body, adorned with yellow flowers, was burned on an open pyre in the presence of his family. As Tirtha watched the boy's body, he was overcome by a strange, unnatural feeling. It seemed as though the dead child radiated warmth, kindness, and love. Tirtha wept, imagining the boy's final moments. Suddenly, he saw a luminous essence rise from the child's body. It ascended and disappeared into a stream of light. In that moment, Tirtha felt an awakening and became aware of his own soul. A vivid, burning sensation of life overwhelmed him. His grief and entire existence took on a spiritual dimension. From then on, he visited the riverbank daily to observe funeral ceremonies, watching for the moment when souls rose from bodies. Yet he noticed that this didn't always happen, leading him to conclude that not all people possessed immortal souls. This realization drove him to become a monk, dedicating himself solely to exploring his own spiritual essence. Michael felt deep compassion for Tirtha. He too carried a heavy burden of guilt over the death of the Sherpa, who had carried his equipment and died in the avalanche. Michael, a mere tourist seeking novelty and adventure, had survived, while a local man earning a living had not. These thoughts made Michael reflect on his own soul. He had always thought of it as something unconscious, never attempting to connect with it. In truth, he had never felt the presence of what people call a spirit, only the emptiness he knew so well. Michael didn't believe in the existence of a soul. Was it worth mourning an imaginary, mythical entity? Even Zen teachings advised focusing on the tangible rather than on fabricated notions. Or so he reasoned. Immersed in these thoughts, Michael had no idea that his true spiritual essence was silently following him. Like a ghostly shadow, it was now always nearby, unseen and intangible. Michael decided to attend a funeral ceremony, one of the many that Tirtha observed. It was held by a small river, and a crowd had gathered. On the shore lay the body of an elderly man. People brought flowers, and a woman wept loudly. At the end of the ceremony, the body was burned, and the skull was cracked open to ensure the soul had departed the body. What Michael remembered most were the weeping people and the nauseating smell. He saw no luminous essence rising from the body. The thought of his own death didn't trouble Michael. What worried him more was the persistent sense that he wasn't truly living, always chasing vivid experiences, yet missing something essential. He couldn't return to the past, but he saw no future either. As for Michael's soul, it knew all about the immortality of the spirit. But the most unbearable thought was that it had abandoned not a lifeless body, but a living man. Chapter 5. Johnny. Michael had too much disdain for religion to consider going to a monastery. Kathmandu was full of eccentric foreigners from all over the world, fleeing their ordinary lives in search of new experiences. From one of them, Michael learned about a place in the mountains where an American had been living for many years. This man followed no particular religion, but helped people reach a higher level of consciousness and understanding. Michael sought out this man. In reality, it was a small community of people who spent their mornings tending to chores, growing potatoes and tomatoes on picturesque terraces, and their afternoons sitting for hours in chairs, admiring the magnificent valley, or meditating, each lost in their own thoughts. Michael rented a small room. At night, it was cold, so he went to see Johnny, the very American he had heard about. Johnny brewed strong black tea, and they settled near an open stove for an unhurried conversation. Michael shared his story, and Johnny invited him to join a meditation session the next day, to focus on his breathing and remain still. The next morning, Michael agreed. But within minutes, the demand for stillness became torture. Boredom overwhelmed him, and restless leg syndrome immediately kicked in. His body seemed to scream at him to get up and run anywhere. While the others meditated calmly, he gave up and stepped outside. The following evening, he and Johnny sat on the terrace, gazing at the stars. Michael spoke about the emptiness that haunted him and asked Johnny what he believed in: a soul, God, or some other force. Johnny smiled and replied, "I do feel my soul. As for God, I'm still figuring that out, but I believe in statistics." He joked that, statistically, 1 in 10 people at their retreat achieved enlightenment, so Michael's chances of salvation were pretty good. Michael laughed, but Johnny turned serious. He explained that he saw something profound in statistical and mathematical laws. They existed independently of human belief, unchanging and constant, governing the universe regardless of our perception. Since the birth of the universe, the odds of it taking on the form we know, with galaxies, stars, and planets, were infinitesimally small. Matter should have dissolved into nothingness. Emptiness is the natural state of nature. Instead of fearing it, you could explore that feeling as a key to truly understanding yourself, Johnny said. Michael pondered this. He had always portrayed emptiness as a nightmare, never considering it as something worthy of attention. "Emptiness is more real than you think," Johnny continued. "The cosmos is mostly emptiness, and so are your molecules. Your personality, yourself, is an illusion. You already know that. So, quite literally, you are nothing. All that's left is to realize it." Michael thought deeply again. He looked at the starry sky, but now saw not the stars, but the black void between them. Johnny taught Michael about focus and freedom from stereotypes. For hours, Michael stared into the darkness between the stars. One day, he saw emptiness as a unified whole. a connection binding the visible and invisible stars into one system, into a single harmony. He realized that every glowing light and every object was connected by emptiness. Like parts of a single painting, emptiness was the primordial foundation where stars ignite, universes are born, evolve, and die. It was a blank canvas upon which he himself had appeared through an extraordinary confluence of events. Emptiness became the key to silencing his endless inner dialogue. Now Michael began to notice not words, but to listen to the inner silence. The same silence where thoughts freely came and went, leaving no trace. Embracing emptiness and silence was his first step. But Michael still couldn't close his eyes and simply immerse himself within, as others did. After 5 minutes, he felt the urge to run again. "Listen to your body and do what it wants," Johnny advised. Michael stood up and ran. Chapter 6. Yasha. Running along mountain trails was grueling work. By evening, Michael would be exhausted and would find a quiet spot to finally sit still. Silent, thoughtless, and focused on the emptiness within. Months passed. Summer arrived. Michael made peace with the sense of emptiness, finding a kind of equilibrium within himself. Yet, this balance felt bland, monotonous, and burdensome. He accepted these sensations as normal, believing they might reflect his true inner reality. One day, after a long run, Michael sat down to meditate. Suddenly, he felt something moving on his lap. Opening his eyes, he saw a black, venomous snake. Its bite could be fatal. His heart froze. He knew even the slightest movement could provoke an attack. The snake slithered slowly, showing no aggression, but also making no effort to leave. Terror gripped him. His throat went dry, and every thought sharpened to painful clarity. He controlled his breathing, feeling each heartbeat as time seemed to slow. His heartbeat grew slower and slower, and at some point, Michael thought it had stopped entirely. He was certain he was dead. The snake was still gliding over his knees, while Michael remained as still as a statue. Then, suddenly, he caught the sharp scent of ozone, a smell deeply familiar from childhood. The scent awakened something deep within him. Michael took an almost imperceptible breath, but it wasn't just air he inhaled. It felt like he was drawing in pure energy. At that moment, something began to stir within him. His body remained motionless, but a bright light, like a stream, rose from the base of his being to the top. Inside, an enormous mirror opened, reflecting his entire life as a single seamless tapestry. He saw everything: his mistakes, his search, and his wandering lost soul. With this vision came an overwhelming sense of serene calm, as if an ocean of pure consciousness had flooded his being. He felt the infinite emptiness of the universe, but it was different now. The emptiness had become radiant, warm, divine. It no longer oppressed him, but instead filled and connected him to something vast and profound. That night, Michael experienced a profound transformation. His inner world changed entirely. There was no longer a Michael, no longer a separate soul. He had found enlightenment and the unity of existence. The next morning, as his meditation ended, Michael realized the snake was gone. He stretched and breathed in the fresh mountain air deeply. His body felt different now, a harmonious blend of spiritual strength, love, freedom, and countless subtle shades of feeling. It seemed as though something natural and true had occurred, something that was always meant to happen. Later, Michael visited Johnny to share his experience. Johnny, as usual, was sitting in a chair on the veranda, gazing out at the valley. Resting peacefully on his lap was the same black snake. Michael froze, stunned by what he saw. "So that's your snake," he muttered in disbelief, still reeling from the events of the night. "Ah, you've met Yasha, huh?" Johnny said with a warm smile, stroking the reptile's back. "He's harmless, but it's amazing how much he's helped people. Probably the best teacher among us." Michael sat down beside him, cradling a cup of hot tea, and began recounting his experience. His voice was quiet yet steady, as if each word came from the depths of his soul. Johnny listened intently, never interrupting, occasionally nodding to keep the pace of the unhurried story. When Michael finished, Johnny gazed thoughtfully into the distance, as if searching through his own reflections, and said, "Many speak of the soul as though it's a given, something eternal to be taken for granted. But maybe the immortal spirit doesn't visit everyone, and when it does, it's only for a fleeting moment. You're lucky, Michael. Only someone who has deeply felt the absence of their soul can truly prepare for its return. Now that it's back with you, treasure it as the most precious thing you have." Chapter 7. The Mirror of the Soul. Michael spent nearly 6 months in Nepal, staying near Johnny's retreat. He simply lived, observing and absorbing every moment. His attention was guided by sensations, familiar physical ones, subtle emotional waves, and new, profound spiritual experiences. He continued to feel the energy rising within him, filling his consciousness with light and elevating it beyond ordinary perception. Michael felt like a wanderer climbing an invisible peak within himself. From this inner summit, his entire life and former beliefs unfolded before him in a new light. During moments of meditation, time seemed to slow. With each deliberate breath, he felt his being fill with pure energy. Alive, free, and immeasurably loving. His awareness expanded, and the radiant mirror of his soul once again reflected his life in its entirety. Thoughts, actions, and desires surfaced in this mirror like dreams, only to dissolve into an infinite sense of inner peace, freedom, and silence. One day, Michael's soul called him toward a new journey, to explore himself and the world. More than anything, he was drawn to the people he met. In each of them, he saw both the ordinary and the mystical. He shared his insights through new stories and books, helping others to look deeper into themselves. And during one of his journeys, Michael found something he hadn't been searching for: love. His soul connected with another, bright and beautiful. In that moment, his heart filled with radiance, tenderness, and warmth. Feelings that defied words and transcended everything he had ever known. But that, perhaps, is an entirely different story.